Lila Bennett wasn't always the woman she is today. At 35, she's got this quiet strength about her, the kind that sneaks up on you. She's a black woman with skin the color of rich espresso, eyes that hold 1,000 stories, and a smile that could light up a room if she let it. Most people in this city know her as the powerhouse behind Bennett Bites, a restaurant empire that's taken the culinary world by storm. We're talking Michelin stars, lines out the door, and a net worth that could make your head spin. But Lila? She didn't start out on top. Growing up, life wasn't kind to her. She was the girl from the wrong side of town, raised by a single dad who worked double shifts at a diner just to keep the lights on. Back then, her dark skin wasn't something people admired. It was a reason to look the other way. She remembers the sting of it all too well. The guys who'd laugh her off when she dared to flirt, the ones who'd say she was too dark to take home to their parents. "You're pretty for a black girl," they'd toss out like it was a compliment. And it cut deeper every time. Lila learned early that love could be a shallow game, and she wasn't winning. Then everything changed. Her dad, Harold Bennett, hit the jackpot with a hotel chain that went from a pipe dream to a billion-dollar business practically overnight. Suddenly, those same guys who'd turned her down were sliding into her life with fake smiles and hungry eyes. The shift was dizzying. One minute she was invisible, the next she was a prize to be won. But Lila saw through it. The attention wasn't for her, it was for the money, the status, the glittering new world her dad had built. That's when she made a choice. She'd find someone who'd love her for her soul, not her bank account. So Lila did something wild. She traded her designer heels for sneakers, her tailored suits for a simple black apron, and started working as a bartender at a little hole-in-the-wall joint called Midnight Haven. Under the name Tara, she poured drinks, wiped down counters, and kept her head down. No one there knew she owned half the restaurants in town. No one knew she could buy the whole damn bar with a single phone call. It was her secret, her experiment, to see if anyone could look past the surface and see her. Not the billionaire heiress, not the polished businesswoman, but Lila, raw and real. She'd been at it for a few months, slinging beers and mixing cocktails, when she started to wonder if it was all a waste of time. Maybe true love was just a fairy tale for someone like her. Maybe the world was too stuck on money and looks to give her what she craved. But then, one rainy Thursday night, the door to Midnight Haven swung open, and in walked someone who'd turn her whole plan upside down. Someone who'd make her question everything she thought she knew about herself and about love. Lila didn't say it out loud, but as she wiped a glass and watched the stranger step inside, a quiet thought flickered in her mind. I'm not just hiding my money here. There's something else I've buried. Something even I don't fully understand yet. She didn't know it then, but that night wasn't just the start of a love story. It was the beginning of unraveling a secret that had been waiting in the shadows for years. The rain was coming down in sheets that Thursday night, drumming against the roof of Midnight Haven like it was trying to break in. Lila, or Tara as everyone here knew her, stood behind the bar polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. It was a slow night, just a handful of regulars nursing their drinks, the kind of crowd that didn't ask questions or care much about the woman pouring their whiskey. She liked it that way. The dim lights and the hum of old jazz from the jukebox gave her a bubble to hide in, a place where she could be invisible for once. Then the door creaked open, and a gust of wet air swept through the room. Lila glanced up, more out of habit than curiosity, and that's when she saw him. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a mess of dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. He shook off his jacket, a beat-up leather thing that'd seen better days, and slung a guitar case over his shoulder. Julian Carter, though she didn't know his name yet, had this quiet energy about him, like he carried a story he wasn't ready to tell. "Hey," he said, his voice low and a little rough, like he'd been singing too long in the damp. "You guys still doing open mic tonight?" Lila nodded, setting the glass down. "Yeah, stage is all yours if you want it. Not much of a crowd, though." He flashed a half smile, the kind that didn't try too hard. "Doesn't matter. I'm just here to play." She watched him head to the tiny stage in the corner, a rickety platform with a single spotlight that flickered like it was on its last legs. He pulled out his guitar, tuned it with quick, practiced hands, and started strumming. The first notes hit the air, soft and mournful, and then he sang. His voice wasn't loud or showy, but it cut through the room like a knife. Raw, soulful, the kind of sound that made you stop and listen even if you didn't want to. Lila found herself leaning against the bar, forgetting the drink she'd been pouring, just caught up in the way he poured himself into every word. The song was about a man chasing a dream that kept slipping away, and something about it hit Lila hard. Maybe it was the way he sang about longing, or maybe it was how he didn't seem to care that only 5 people were listening. When he finished, the handful of regulars clapped, and he gave a little nod before stepping off the stage. Lila caught his eye as he walked over to the bar, and for a second, she forgot she was supposed to be Tara, the nobody. "Good set," she said, sliding a beer his way before he even asked. "On the house." "Thanks," he said, taking it with a grin. "Didn't expect a free drink for that. I'm Julian, by the way." "Tara," she replied, the lie slipping out smooth as ever. "You play here often?" "First time. I usually gig at bigger spots, but they've been drying up lately. Figured I'd try something smaller." He took a sip, then looked at her, not the way most guys did, sizing her up, but like he was actually seeing her. "You been here long?" "A few months," she said, keeping it vague. "It's a good place to think." He chuckled. "Yeah, I get that. Quiet's hard to come by these days." They talked for a while after that, nothing heavy, just music, the rain, the way the city felt different at night. He told her he was 32, chasing a music career that hadn't quite taken off yet. "I've got a day job fixing cars," he admitted with a shrug. "Keeps the lights on, but this," he tapped his guitar case, "this is what keeps me going." Lila liked that about him, the way he didn't pretend to be more than he was. Most guys she'd met tried to puff themselves up, especially once they sniffed out her money. But Julian, he was just real. She caught herself smiling more than she meant to, laughing at his dry jokes about the auto shop, feeling a warmth she hadn't let herself feel in years. The night stretched on, and he played another set, something lighter this time, a song about finding hope in unexpected places. When he finished, he came back to the bar, and they picked up right where they left off. "You've got a good ear," he said, nodding toward the jukebox. "Most people don't notice the music in a place like this." "My dad used to play jazz at home," she said, letting a sliver of truth slip out. "Guess it stuck with me." "Mine too," Julian said, his eyes lighting up. "Saxophone guy. Drove my mom nuts, but I loved it." It was a small thing, that shared memory, but it felt like a thread tying them together. By the time the bar closed, the rain had stopped, and Julian lingered while she locked up. "You walking home?" he asked, hands shoved in his pockets. "Yeah, not far," she lied. Her real place was a penthouse across town, but Tara's fake apartment was just a few blocks away. "Mind if I walk with you? Streets get weird this late." She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, thanks." They walked in comfortable silence at first, the city humming around them, car horns, distant sirens, the occasional laugh from a drunk stumbling out of another bar. Julian didn't push her to talk, didn't fill the quiet with nonsense. It was nice, different. When they got to Tara's building, he stopped at the steps. "See you around?" he asked, more hope than question in his voice. "Maybe," she said, smiling despite herself. "If you play here again." "Deal," he grinned, then turned to go, guitar case bouncing against his back. Lila watched him disappear around the corner, her heart doing this stupid little flip she couldn't ignore. She climbed the steps to the dingy apartment she'd rented for this charade, shut the door, and leaned against it. Julian Carter wasn't like anyone she'd met before. Not at the bar, not in her real life. He didn't know her money, her power, her name. He just knew Tara, the girl who listened to his songs and laughed at his stories. But as she kicked off her shoes and sank onto the lumpy couch, that quiet thought from earlier crept back in. I'm not just hiding my money. There was something else, something buried deep, and meeting Julian felt like the first tug on a thread she wasn't sure she wanted to pull. She didn't know it yet, but that thread was tied to a moment from years ago, a moment that had changed everything she thought she was building with him. The weeks after that rainy night slipped by like a song you can't get out of your head. Lila found herself counting down the hours until her shifts at Midnight Haven, hoping Julian would walk through that creaky door again, and he did. Every Thursday, like clockwork, with his guitar slung over his shoulder and that easy grin that made her stomach twist in the best way. It wasn't just the music, though that was part of it. It was him, Julian Carter, all rough edges and quiet dreams, who somehow made her feel like Tara wasn't just a mask, but a piece of who she could have been. Their talks stretched longer each time. He'd finish his set, slide onto a bar stool, and they'd lose themselves in conversation over cheap beer and the hum of the jukebox. He told her about the gigs he'd played, small venues, smoky dives, the occasional street corner when times got tight. "I almost made it once," he said one night, tracing the rim of his glass with a calloused finger. "Had a producer sniffing around, but it fell through. Story of my life." "Don't sell yourself short," Lila said, pouring him another. "You've got something real up there. People feel it." He looked at her then, really looked, and there was this spark in his hazel eyes that made her breath catch. "You think so?" "I know so," she shot back, and the way he smiled, like he actually believed her, stuck with her, long after he left. It wasn't all heavy stuff. They'd laugh over dumb things too, like the time he tried to fix a customer's car in the parking lot and ended up drenched in oil, or how she'd invented a terrible cocktail on a dare and watched a regular choke it down just to be polite. One night, he grabbed her hand and pulled her out from behind the bar during a slow shift. "Dance with me," he said, spinning her to some old blues tune crackling through the speakers. She protested, giggling, but let him lead her anyway, her sneakers scuffing the sticky floor. For a minute, she forgot she was supposed to be Tara, forgot the penthouse waiting across town, forgot everything but the warmth of his hand in hers. They started meeting outside the bar too. Late-night diner runs, walks through the park when the leaves were just starting to turn. He'd bring his guitar sometimes, playing soft melodies on a bench while she leaned back and listened, the city fading into the background. She fed him half-truths about her life. A dad who loved jazz, a mom she'd lost too young to cancer, a childhood scraping by. It wasn't all lies, just enough truth to keep her cover, enough to feel real without giving herself away. Julian didn't push, didn't dig. He just took her as she was, and that scared her as much as it thrilled her. But not everyone bought the act. Marcus Reed showed up one night, and Lila knew trouble when she saw it. He was 34, sharp-eyed and slick, with a leather jacket that screamed money and a smirk that said he owned the room. Julian introduced him as an old friend, a music producer who'd given him his first shot years back. "Marcus is the guy who almost got me a deal," Julian said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Then he ditched me for the big leagues." "Had to eat, man," Marcus replied, his voice smooth as whiskey. His eyes slid to Lila, lingering a beat too long. "Who's this?" "Tara?" she said, keeping her tone flat, wiping down the bar like he was just another customer. "Nice to meet you, Tara." He said her name like he was tasting it, and she didn't like the way it sounded coming from him. There was something off about Marcus, too polished, too calculating. He stuck around that night watching Julian play, but Lila caught him staring at her more than once, his brow furrowing like he was trying to place her. The next time he came by, he didn't bring Julian. It was a Tuesday, quiet, and he slid onto a stool right in front of her. "You're good at this," he said, nodding at the drink she mixed him. "Real steady hands." "Where'd you learn?" "Picked it up over the years," she said, shrugging. "You here to scout talent or just drink?" "Little of both." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You don't talk like a bartender, you know that? Got this labbity-luck vibe, like you used to running things, not serving them." Her pulse kicked up, but she kept her face blank. "Guess I'm just good at faking it." He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. Funny thing, though, I swear, I've seen you somewhere before. Not here, somewhere bigger." "Doubt it," she said, turning away to stack glasses. "I don't get out much." Marcus didn't push it then, but he started showing up more often, always with that same sharp gaze, like he was peeling back her layers one by one. Lila brushed it off at first. Paranoia, she told herself. She'd been careful. No one at Midnight Haven knew her real name, her real life. She didn't wear the designer stuff, didn't flash the confidence that came with running a billion-dollar business. But Marcus wasn't like the regular. He was the type who sniffed out secrets for sport. and she could feel him circling. Meanwhile, things with Julian were getting deeper. One night, after a gig, he walked her home again, but this time he didn't leave at the steps. He looked at her, the streetlight catching the gold in his eyes, and said, "I don't know what it is about you, Tara, but you're different. Like you get me in a way nobody else does." Her heart thudded, guilt and longing twisting together. "You're not so bad yourself," she managed, voice softer than she meant it to be. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Can I kiss you?" She should have said no. Should have kept the line firm between Tara and Lila. But she nodded, and when his lips met hers, gentle at first, then hungry, it was like the whole world shrank down to just them. She melted into it, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that this could be real. But as they pulled apart, breathless and grinning, she saw Marcus across the street, leaning against a lamppost, phone in hand. He wasn't close enough to hear, but the way he watched them sent a chill down her spine. Julian didn't notice, too caught up in the moment, but Lila knew something had shifted. Marcus wasn't just curious anymore, he was on to her. Later, alone in her fake apartment, she paced the tiny room, replaying his words. "I've seen you somewhere before." She'd covered her tracks, hadn't she? No one could connect Tara to Lila Bennett, the restaurateur who'd graced magazine covers and charity galas, but Marcus wasn't letting it go, and that meant trouble was brewing. She didn't know how close he was to the truth, or how much it had hurt Julian when he found out. What she didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't the only one with a secret. There was something else waiting to surface, something tied to Julian and her past, something that'd make her lies look small in comparison. Lila thought she could keep it together. She'd been so careful, months of playing Tara, perfecting the slouch of her shoulders, the casual way she'd toss out a laugh, the little lies that rolled off her tongue like they were nothing. She'd built this whole other life at Midnight Haven, and for a while, it felt like it might actually work. Julian was the reason it felt worth it. The way he'd look at her after a song, like she was the only person in the room, or how he'd pull her close on those late-night walks, his voice soft against her ear. She was falling for him, hard, and that made the tightrope she was walking feel even shakier. But Marcus Reed wasn't the kind of guy who let things slide. He'd been sniffing around for weeks now, showing up at the bar unannounced, asking questions that sounded innocent but cut too close. Lila caught him snapping a photo of her once, quick and sneaky while she was pouring a drink. "Just capturing the vibe," he'd said with that slick grin, but she didn't buy it. She started keeping her head down more, avoiding his gaze, hoping he'd get bored and move on. She should have known better. Guys like Marcus didn't back off when they smelled blood. It all came crashing down on a Friday night, one of those packed evenings when the bar buzzed with energy. Julian was on stage, mid-set, his voice weaving through a slow, aching ballad that had the crowd hooked. Lila stood behind the bar watching him, a stupid smile tugging at her lips despite herself. She didn't see Marcus come in, not at first. He slipped through the door like a shadow, weaving past the regulars until he was right in front of her, his leather jacket gleaming under the dim lights. "Tara?" he said, loud enough to cut through the music. Heads turned, but he didn't care. He slapped a stack of papers on the bar, photos, printouts, stuff she couldn't make out at a glance. Or should I say, Lila Bennett. Her stomach dropped like she'd been punched. She froze, hands gripping the edge of the counter, the noise of the bar fading into a dull roar in her ears. "What are you talking about?" she managed, but her voice cracked, giving her away. "Don't play dumb," Marcus said, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. "Took me a while, but I figured it out. You're not some broke bartender. You're the Lila Bennett, Bennett Bites, billionaire food queen." "What's a rich girl like you doing slumming it here?" He raised his voice, making sure it carried. "Oh, right, playing pretend with my boy Julian." The song faltered. Julian stopped strumming, his eyes locking onto them from the stage. The crowd murmured, confused. But Marcus wasn't done. He held up a photo, a glossy magazine shot of Lila at a gala, all polished and poised, nothing like the woman in the apron standing there now. "Found this online," he said, tossing it down. "And this," he pulled out another, a grainy shot of her leaving her penthouse, time-stamped just last week. You've been lying to everyone, haven't you? Lila's heart pounded so loud she could barely think. Marcus, stop, she hissed, but he ignored her, turning to the stage where Julian was stepping down, guitar still in hand. Julian, man, you gotta hear this, Marcus called out, waving him over. Your girl's been running a game on you. She's loaded, owns half the damn city. This whole Tara thing, it's bullshit. Julian reached them, his face a mix of confusion and something darker. What's going on? He asked, looking between Marcus and Lila. His voice was steady, but she could hear the edge in it, the crack starting to form. Ask her, Marcus said, stepping back with a smug nod. Ask your little bartender why she's been faking it this whole time. Lila's mouth went dry. She wanted to run, to disappear through the back door and never look back, but her feet wouldn't move. Julian turned to her, his hazel eyes searching hers, and all she could see was the trust she'd spent months building start to crumble. Tara, he said, quieter now. What's he talking about? She swallowed hard, the lie she'd lived clawing at her throat. She stopped, then took a shaky breath. He's right. My name's not Tara, it's Lila. Lila Bennett. The air between them shifted, heavy and thick. Julian's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything, just waited. She pushed on, the words spilling out like they'd been waiting too long. I own Bennett Bites. My dad's Harold Bennett, the hotel guy. I've got money, yeah, a lot of it. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see me, not all that. See you. Julian's voice broke on the words, sharp and raw. You think I wouldn't have? You didn't give me a chance. You just lied. Every night, every talk, that kiss. He stopped, running a hand through his hair, his face twisting with hurt. Was any of it real, or was I just some experiment to you? It was real, she said, stepping closer, desperate for him to believe her. Every second of it. I didn't plan to fall for you, Julian, but I did. I've been burned before. Guys who didn't want me until the money showed up. I needed to know you were different. He laughed, but it was bitter, hollow. Different? You don't even know me if you think I'd care about your cash. I've been scraping by my whole life. I don't give a damn about that. But this, he gestured at the photos, at her. This is you not trusting me. You made me the fool here, not them. Julian, please. She reached for him, but he pulled back, the distance between them widening like a chasm. I need air, he muttered, grabbing his guitar case. He didn't look at her as he pushed through the crowd, the door slamming shut behind him. Marcus clapped slowly, a mocking little applause. Well, that went about as expected. You're welcome, Lila. Saved him from a gold digger in reverse. Get out, she snapped, her voice shaking with fury. Now. He shrugged, sauntering off like he'd won something, leaving her standing there with the weight of her own mess. The regulars stared, whispering, but she didn't care. She grabbed her jacket, threw it on, and bolted out the back, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. Julian was gone. Down the street, out of sight. Maybe out of her life. She stumbled to her fake apartment, the one she'd kept up for this stupid charade, and sank onto the floor, head in her hands. Tears came fast, hot and messy, because she'd lost him. Not just the idea of him, but the real Julian, the guy who'd danced with her in a dingy bar and kissed her like she was the only thing that mattered. She'd wanted to protect herself, but all she'd done was break something she hadn't even known she needed so badly. What stung worse was the nagging feeling she couldn't shake, that this wasn't the end of it. Marcus had torn her world apart, sure, but there was something else lurking, something she didn't see coming. She didn't know it yet, but the truth she'd hidden wasn't the only one waiting to come out. There was a bigger secret, one tied to Julian, one that had been buried for years, and it was about to change everything she'd thought she'd lost. Lila didn't leave her penthouse for days after that night. The fake apartment felt too small, too suffocating, so she retreated to the real her, the sprawling, sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she'd conquered. She threw herself into work, barking orders at her team over the phone, tweaking menus for Bennett Bites, anything to keep her mind off Julian. But it didn't work. Every quiet moment she saw his face, the hurt in his eyes, the way he'd walked out without looking back. She'd messed up, bad, and there was no fixing it, or so she thought. Her dad, Harold, noticed something was off when he called her that weekend. "You sound like hell, kid," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the line. "What's eating you?" "Nothing," she lied, staring out at the skyline. "Just tired." "Bull, I know my girl. Spill it." She sighed, sinking into her leather couch, and let it all pour out. The bar, Tara, Julian, Marcus, the whole ugly mess. Harold listened, quiet for once, until she finished. "So you lost him?" he said finally. "That why you're hiding up there?" "I'm not hiding," she snapped, then softened. "Okay, maybe I am. I don't know how to face him, Dad. He hates me." "He doesn't hate you," Harold said, firm but gentle. "He's hurt. Big difference. But listen, Lila, I've been meaning to tell you something. Come over tomorrow. We need to talk, face to face." She didn't like the weight in his tone, but she agreed. The next day, she drove to his estate on the edge of town, a sprawling place with manicured lawns and more rooms than anyone needed. Harold was waiting in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand, looking older than she remembered. His hair was grayer now, his shoulders a little more stooped, but his eyes still had that fire she'd always leaned on. "Sit," he said, nodding at the armchair across from him. "This isn't easy to say." Lila's stomach twisted. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he waved her off. "It's not about me, it's about you. And that boy you're torn up over." "Julian?" She frowned, leaning forward. "What's he got to do with you?" Harold took a slow sip of his drink, then set it down, his hands folding together like he was bracing himself. 10 years ago, I almost died. You remember that, right? The car accident?" "Yeah," she said, nodding. "You were coming back from a meeting, hit some ice. Mom was a wreck about it." "Uh-huh. What I didn't tell anyone was that I didn't get out of that wreck on my own. Car flipped, pinned me under the dash. I was bleeding out, stuck there in the snow, thinking that was it. Then this kid shows up, couldn't have been more than 22, 23, pulled me out, stayed with me till the ambulance got there, saved my damn life." Lila's chest tightened, a strange feeling creeping up her spine. "Okay, but what's that got to do with Julian?" Harold reached into a drawer, pulled out an old photo and slid it across the desk. It was grainy, faded, a shot from a local newspaper article about the crash. There was her dad's wrecked sedan, snow piled around it, and a blurry figure standing nearby, talking to a paramedic. She squinted, her breath catching as the face came into focus. Dark hair, broad shoulders, that same leather jacket she'd seen 100 times now. "That's him," Harold said, tapping the photo. "Julian Carter, the kid who dragged me out of that car. I didn't know his name back then. Just thanked him, sent him a check he never cashed. Took me years to track him down. And when you said his name the other day, it clicked." Lila stared at the photo, her hands trembling. Julian, her Julian, had saved her dad's life a decade ago? Her mind raced back to that time. She'd been 25, buried in grad school, barely home when it happened. She'd never met the guy who'd pulled Harold out, never thought twice about it. And now he was the man she'd lied to, the man she'd lost. "This can't be real," she whispered, looking up at her dad. "He never said anything." "Probably didn't know who I was to you," Harold said. "Hell, I didn't know who he was to me till now. But Lila, that's fate right there. You don't run into a guy like that twice by accident." She sat back, the room spinning. Julian had been part of her life before she even knew him, a quiet hero in a story she'd never bothered to read. And she'd repaid him with lies, with a fake name, with a betrayal he didn't deserve. "What do I do?" she asked, voice breaking. "He won't even talk to me." "You go to him," Harold said, leaning forward. "You tell him the truth. All of it. Not just about the money, but this. He's got a right to know. And you've got a right to fight for him." Lila spent the rest of the day in a daze, the photo burning a hole in her pocket. She drove back to the city, her mind a mess of guilt and hope and something she couldn't name. That night, she stood in her kitchen, staring at the phone, debating whether to call him. But what would she say? Hey, sorry I lied. Oh, and by the way, you saved my dad's life once? It sounded crazy, even to her. Instead, she grabbed her coat and headed to Midnight Haven. She hadn't been back since Marcus blew her cover, but she knew Julian still played there sometimes. The bar was quiet when she walked in, just a few stragglers at the tables. The bartender, a guy she'd trained, gave her a nod, no questions asked. And then she saw him, up on that rickety stage, strumming a slow tune that hit her like a punch to the gut. He didn't see her at first, too lost in the music, his voice low and ragged. The song was new, one she hadn't heard before, and the lyrics stopped her cold. Thought I knew her shadow, thought I held her flame, but she slipped right through me, left me with a name. It was about her. Tara, Lila, whoever he thought she'd been. Her eyes stung, but she didn't move, just stood there in the back, letting his words wash over her. When he finished, the sparse crowd clapped, and he stepped off the stage, slinging his guitar over his shoulder. That's when he saw her. His face hardened, the warmth she'd loved replaced by something cold and guarded. He started toward the door, but she cut him off, stepping into his path. "Julian, wait," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to talk to you." "Why?" he shot back, his tone sharp. "You got more lies to sell me?" "No lies," she said, holding up her hands. "Just the truth. All of it, please." "Just 5 minutes." He stared at her, jaw tight, then nodded once. 5 minutes, that's it." She took a deep breath, pulling the photo from her pocket. "This is about you and my dad. 10 years ago, you saved his life, and I didn't know until yesterday." Julian's eyes flicked to the photo, then back to her, confusion cutting through the anger. "What the hell are you talking about?" And that's when she started talking. Really talking, praying he'd listen long enough to hear her out. Lila stood there in the dim light of Midnight Haven, the photo trembling in her hand as she faced Julian. His eyes were locked on her, hard and searching, like he was waiting for the catch. The bar was quiet now, just the faint clink of glasses and the low murmur of the few remaining patrons. She could feel their stares, but none of that mattered. Only him, only this moment. 10 years ago, she started, her voice steadier than she felt. "My dad was in a car accident, flipped off the road in a snowstorm, trapped. He would have died if someone hadn't pulled him out. That someone was you, Julian. You were 22 working at some coffee shop nearby, and you saved him." She held out the photo, the blurry image of a younger him standing by that wrecked car. "I didn't know until yesterday. He didn't either. Not till I told him about you." Julian took the photo, his fingers brushing hers for a split second. He stared at it, his brow furrowing, like he was digging through a memory he'd buried deep. I remember that," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Guy in a suit, bleeding all over the snow. I didn't stick around after the ambulance showed up. Didn't think it mattered." He looked up at her, confusion giving way to something raw. "That was your dad?" "Yeah," she said, nodding. "Harold Bennett. And I'm so sorry I didn't tell you who I was from the start. I didn't mean to hurt you, Julian. I spent my whole life being judged, too dark for some, too rich for others. I wanted you to see me without all that crap in the way, but I screwed it up and I'll regret it forever if you can't forgive me." He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, the photo still in his hand. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he wasn't ready to spit out. Finally, he let out a rough breath, running a hand through his hair. "You think I cared about your money? Lila, I've been broke my whole damn life. I don't give a shit about that. What kills me is you didn't trust me. You let me fall for you, and it was all built on quicksand." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I was scared. Scared you'd turn into one of those guys who only saw dollar signs. But you're not them, you never were. What I felt with you, that was real. Every laugh, every kiss, every stupid dance in this bar. It was me. Not Tara, not some lie." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the fight in his eyes, the anger wrestling with something softer. "And this?" He held up the photo. "You're telling me this now because what? Because it's some cosmic sign?" "Maybe," she said, stepping closer. "Or maybe it's just the truth I owe you. You saved my dad, Julian. You gave me back the one person who's always had my back, and then you walked into my life and gave me something else, something I didn't even know I was looking for. I love you, and I'm begging you to give me a chance to start over, No masks, no games. The air hung heavy between them, thick with everything unsaid. Julian's gaze dropped to the floor, then back to her, and she saw the wall he'd built start to crack. "I loved you too, you know," he said, voice low and rough. "Still do, even though it pisses me off. But I can't just forget it all, Lila. Not yet." "I'm not asking you to forget," she said. "I'm asking you to try. With me. We can figure it out together." He nodded, slow and deliberate, like he was testing the weight of her words. "Okay, but no more secrets. You're Lila Bennett to me now, not Tara, not anyone else." Deal, she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek as she smiled. A month later, they stood side by side at one of her restaurants, a cozy spot she'd turned into a stage for a charity concert. Julian played that night, his voice filling the room, and Lila watched from the crowd. No apron, no disguise, just herself. When he finished, he pulled her up with him, their hands locked together, and the applause wasn't just for his music. It was for them, for the messy, real thing they'd built out of broken trust and second chances.